Okay, I would now like you all to join me in welcoming our panelists for our first session, starting with Ms. Mahua Roy Choudhury from the Bihar Rural Livelihoods Promotion Society of the Government of Bihar. Mahua ji is a development professional with specialization in knowledge management, program management, public policy, institutional building, and rural livelihood promotion. She has over 24 years of work experience with government and non-government agencies. She's a Chevening Clore Leadership Fellow and a NUFIC Fellow. She's also been a core team member in conceptualizing the World Bank-supported Bihar Integrated Social Protection Strengthening Project and the Bihar Transformative Development Project and the DFID-supported sector-wide approach for strengthening health, the SWASTH project. So welcome, Mahua ji. Our second panelist is Mr. Manish Sabharwal. I believe he's here now. Yes. Welcome, sir. He's the Vice Chairman of Team Lease Services, which is India's largest staffing human capital firm. Mr. Manish has served on various policy committees for education, employment, employability, and has previously also served as an independent director on the board of the Reserve Bank of India. He's a member of the advisory board for the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, a governing board member of the NCARE, the National Council of Applied Economic Research, a managing trustee of the New India Foundation that offers fellowships for writing books about post-1947 India, and he's also a columnist for the Indian Express. Welcome, sir. And our third panelist today is Ms. Aparna Uppaluri, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Tata Trusts, leading philanthropic programs and has operational and strategic planning oversight over all thematic areas, including livelihoods, health, nutrition, WASH, as well as arts and culture. In her previous role, she served as the Senior Global Program Officer at the Ford Foundation and the Acting Program Director of the Foundation's India, Nepal, and the Sri Lanka office. She's an interdisciplinary professional in the fields of philanthropy, women's rights, public health, education, arts, and culture. Her work has focused on addressing issues of inequality, building gender justice, nurturing philanthropic collaboratives, intergovernmental partnerships, and strategic field building across thematic areas. And she has also managed large collaborative funds with global teams across the world. So welcome, ma'am. Welcome all of you today. Over to you, Aishwarya.
Wonderful. Thank you, Satya. Is everyone able to hear me okay? No, maybe this mic. I'll speak as loud. It's turned on. Great. Great. Thank you very much to the three of you for agreeing to be with us today and to share your reflections. I think it's going to be a wonderful set of perspectives. Mahua coming in with all of your experience running these very large government effort. Manish with all of your experience from the private sector, and Aparna, of course, from this very broad set of influences throughout your professional career. So to start with, I think it would be lovely, you have heard some of these kind of frameworks and sort of background data points on how we can start to think about making sense of gender gaps in labor markets in South Asia. So to open with, would love to hear your just reflections on what you see as some of the key pieces to pay attention to when it comes to labor force participation, employment, occupational selection, wage dynamics, any of those in South Asia. So Mahua, we will start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe I'm audible? Yeah, okay. Gender, as I perceive, is a transgenerational issue, and it needs to be addressed right from, pre-birth till the end of the life. And in the societies that we dwell in, we are facing a lot of societal as well as structural changes. because of globalization, because of urbanization, and the most vulnerable in this entire process are women. And if we talk about their participation in the labor force is critical as well as important, but our patriarchal society has actually barred them from actually contributing in the labor force markets. Since independence, I think there has been a lot of active labor force strategies, passive labor force strategies that have come up, but we are not seeing the results being reflected in the absolute figures. Now, why is this happening is a question for all of us, either the practitioners or the policymakers or even the researchers. I, with my experience and with my own, it's personal opinion, I think we didn't do our data right. You know, if we go to the agriculture department, we'll not get the data of women participating in the agriculture labor, because where we all know when we are in the fields that most of the labor work in the agriculture field is done by the women. We are not registering their contribution anywhere. Secondly, if we go even in the industries department or any other department, say for the health department and any other place, we'll have most of the women participating in the entire public health domain. But are their contributions being registered anywhere? I think, for the researchers and the policymakers, it's all on the dashboard and it's all what you get in the MIS data. But are we capturing those data rightly is something that we need to really work upon. And that is the reason why World Bank has come up with a new policy saying that all the projects that they are going to support would have a digital component of 10% in it. So our governments needs to register and provide that data. I think these data gaps are something which is not getting reflected in our research and policy works. So this is one big constraint I would feel, I think that we need to really capture. We work with several variables and it's very difficult for our information science to capture all the variables in one dashboard. So it's a lot of policy research, and I think a lot of research work needs to be happening in this particular area. How do you capture the data? How do you really work upon registering the contributions in the data form? Whenever it's in an organized sector, you have all the data. But people are contributing in the economy from the unorganized sector as well. So how do you capture the data of the unorganized contributions? So these are some areas that we need to really reflect upon. The second component of not getting reflected in our research works or in our studies is that we boast of so many good programs happening across the country. We are having the National Rural Livelihood Mission working, where we are working with 10 million rural women, where we have institutionalized them into community institutions and see the studies of their achievements, of the National Rural Livelihood Missions are enormous. I mean, in the parameters of women empowerment, if you are talking about the mobility parameters or the participation in taking up entrepreneurial activity, access to credit. So if I only talk about Bihar, then Bihar has been able to leverage 400 billion Indian rupees from the banks, and all these SAG women have been able to do it. So that's actually going into the economy. I don't say that all 100% of these loans are being used for productive purposes, but directly or indirectly, it's all for the productive purposes. So if you are even investing on health, you are contributing into the economy or in the productive manner. So if that is the amount of leverage that one state can make, then imagine how the National Rural Livelihood Mission has been able to do the financial inclusion and directly to the women. So where are these being captured and registered in our entire processes? So this is something that we really need to work upon. I think researchers and universities need to come up with solutions on this particular area. How do we capture all these activities? On the other area, on the softer ground, I would say that the entire women are working in the care economy, and which also goes unregistered. Now, if the women would not have, educated women would not have compromised her high-flung career and looked after her children, I think our next generation would not be a good citizen. So you need to acknowledge and register their contributions in the care economy, and also start working on acknowledging women into the entire labor force participation. I think the whole definition of labor force participation needs to be rethought, revamped, and I think the entire research or the studies and the surveys needs to be reworked upon when we are talking about labor force participation. And I personally think, when you were presenting, that maybe these gaps, we are talking about all the economies which are growing economies. India is one of the biggest example of it. And without the contribution of women, how can you think of the economy being growing? So even if there is not a direct contribution in the labor force, there is a subtle, silent contribution which is making the economy grow. So that needs to be acknowledged and highlighted in some point in time. I think if we keep on saying the gap is increasing, we are talking about a labor force participation definition which was, very, very relevant some 20, 30 years back, but it's not relevant now. We need to redefine it, rework upon it, and conceptualize it, and start taking surveys and doing studies on these angles. And I think, as I'm working very closely with the government, so we are seeing every department, every organization, or every program is making immense lot of improvements and giving services to the community, to the citizens. But actually, it is not getting reflected in the absolute figures. That means there is somewhere a problem in registering, serving, and studying those things in a more relevant and more contemporary points. I'll end there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mahua. There were a lot of great points, and I think these questions on data, on measurement are very relevant, and we're hoping to dig into that this afternoon as well in a session that's just on that, because it's so complex, and we definitely do want to capture reality and do what it takes to capture reality. Great. Manish, over to you.
So this feels a little above my pay grade, because I look at it from a very narrow perspective, and I'm a people supply chain company, and so in my mind, there's just 4 possible explanations or problems for this. The first one is the cultural one, which we've already started talking about, which drives me crazy, because cultural explanations for poverty can at best be the soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst they can be racism. At least in economics we have found that, right? Between 1820 and 1950, India grew at 0.1%, and from 1950 to 1991 we grew at 2%. And some idiot economist called it the Hindu rate of growth. We've grown at 7% since then, and we didn't shoot all the Hindus. So clearly there was something incomplete in that explanation. I'm not saying it was totally useless, but at least in my mind, I also find cultural explanations for stuff hard to deal with, because we're always thinking not to describe the problem, but we're hoping to change it, right? And it's very hard to deal with Indian men as a sort of disease or something like that, right? So I think if we could, at least in my mind, the first explanation of cultural, I'm sure there may be solutions, maybe the son preference in Haryana, which I saw a recent paper is coming down, maybe there were some interventions which worked. But even the paper writer whom I wrote to said, well, maybe it was just economic growth which brought it down. So at least cultural explanations, I'm happy to understand more about possible solutions to that. What I understand well are the three other problems: demand, supply, and matching. And matching is the lowest hanging fruit, right? I mean, Peter Diamond's paper on search costs many years ago was one of the motivations for us to start our company. But Shapley and Roth's work on sort of equity markets clear on price, but labor markets clear on information, really revamped on how we thought about our matching engines, on how we made our registrations almost assessments and stuff like that, right? So you start thinking about matching in different ways. But obviously the problem may be, if matching was the only problem, then employment exchanges or Naukri would have solved the problem, right? Matching may be the lowest hanging fruit, but it's not always working that easily, even though we've thrown a lot of technology at matching in the last 5 years. So then there's a problem with demand and supply. The demand problem is obvious. There are 63 million enterprises in India. 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million are registered for GST, only 1 million pay social security. There are only 23,500 companies in India with a paid-up capital of more than 10 crores. So 6.3 crore enterprises means nothing if it only translates to 23,500 companies with a paid-up capital. Within that sort of stack or pyramid of enterprises, we obviously have the baby versus dwarf problem. You know, as an entrepreneur, you can start two companies, a baby and a dwarf. Both are small. One is going to grow, one is going to stay there. You have the self-employed versus self-exploitation problem. You obviously have the jobs to people versus people to jobs problem. But in the demand side, I think framing it as a jobs problem may be a mistake. I think it's a wages problem. That's why I disagree with Mahua, because we got very good at capturing data on unemployment, and unemployment in India has stayed between 4 and 8% since independence, but poverty has been at 30, 40. So the problem was never jobs, because if you frame the problem as jobs, you'll throw money from helicopters, you'll mandate a 3-day work week, you'll take away people's shovels and give them spoons. You know, if you're digging with spoons, you're not unemployed, but you're clearly going to stay in poverty. But if you shift the sort of problem as wages, then you'll start thinking about productivity, right? You won't think that just a job is good enough. I mean, does the job, I don't even talk living wages far away. Does it give a minimum wage? What is the productivity? And within wages, then you'll start thinking about my 3 biggest problems, which is the difference between nominal wages and real wages, because a kid in Gwalior today says, give me 6,000 rupees in Gwalior, 8,000 rupees in Gurgaon, 15,000 rupees in Delhi, and 25,000 rupees in Bombay. My bags are packed, tell me where you want me to go. And so employers care about nominal wages and employees care about real wages, and I'm not able to get, you know, we have 400,000 employees on any day, but we have only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job, even though we've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 20 years. So I think the difference between real wages and nominal wages is a real problem for us, which is nothing to do with employers and nothing to do with kids. It's just bad urbanization, right? There's a difference between what gross wages and net wages, right? Whenever I go to a job fair, and women particularly, men of course, but they say, haath wali salary or chitti wali salary, right? Are you going to give me 20,000 rupees which you're writing in the letter, or are you giving me the 12,000 rupees which you're giving me in my hand after you take away PF, ESI, EDLI, Labor Welfare Board, and the 8 sort of deductions which I make? I mean, I pay 400 crores of Provident Fund a month. I'm not sure that's, I don't grudge it, but I'm not sure, I do think that, you know, kids can't live on 55% of their salary. I deduct 45% of kids' salary to various social security programs. And I'm not sure they can live on half their salary, so that may be a common problem. And then obviously the government versus private wages, you know. Government wages at the bottom, the government pays too much at the bottom and too little at the top. And at the bottom it's like LIBOR, it's a fudge rate, but since it's like LIBOR, everybody prices off it, and then that creates its own sort of complexities. I think we should raise wages, but we should raise it through productivity rather than artificial. So the demand side is clear to me, at least, that we don't need 63 million enterprises in India. The US economy is 8 times our size. It has 24 million enterprises. So most of these enterprises can go from my perspective. The supply side is, we'll talk about that. There's a mismatch problem, which is repairing supply for demand, and there's a pipeline problem, which is preparing supply for demand. And I distinguish between repair and prepare on the duration of the course or the opening balance of the child. We've made a lot of progress in curriculum, in pedagogy, and assessment. What we haven't solved is financing. Who's going to pay? Everybody's trying to topi now the other person, right? The kids want parents to pay, parents want government to pay, government wants employers to pay, employers come back to government to pay, because there is a financing failure, right? Employers are willing to pay a premium for trained candidates, but we're not willing to pay for training or candidates. Candidates are not willing to pay for training, they're willing to pay for the job. Banks or microfinance aren't willing to lend to us unless a job is guaranteed. So we have to spend a little more time on the supply side saying who pays is really important. And I think at least we have come to the conclusion of 5 design principles: learning while learning, learning by doing, learning with qualification modularity, learning with flexible delivery, and learning with employer signaling value, not social signaling value, right? So learning while learning is obvious. Many kids can't pay for, and in fact, I hope and I think India is going to be the first country in the world where employed learners cross full-time learners. Because that's really the future of learning, and it's key for India. Learning by doing is key. I mean, soft skills are not taught, they are caught. Most people figure out technical skills, but the employer sort of skills that we're looking for. And I don't define soft skills as creativity, I just define soft skills. Tuck your shirt and take a bath, shave, cut your nails. I mean, I'm going to that soft skill, and that's just caught in a workplace. And I don't grudge it, but it happens. Learning while modularity means a 3-month certificate has to be an opening balance for a 1-year diploma, has to be opening balance for a 2-year diploma, has to be opening balance for degree. Learning with flexible and online classroom has to be equal academically to an on-job classroom, which has to be equal to an on-campus classroom, which has to be equal to an on-site classroom. Today we have an apartheid between sort of classrooms look like campus classrooms, while we have 3 other classrooms which we'd like to equalize. And obviously, learning with signaling value is not the social signaling value of Michael Spence, it's just the employer signaling value, I mean, Yale is a good place to be at, but it's a better place to be from, right? So the fundamental value in the past of the education system, and we employers started using this as a lazy proxy for filtering. But the world has produced more graduates in the last 30 years than the 400 years before that. And so for us employers now, using that as a lazy proxy is becoming harder and harder, because you have to kiss 200 frogs to find your princess. We used to kiss 50, but now we're starting to kiss 400, because everybody seems to have a degree. So I think for us, this employer signaling value is we're starting to get frustrated with the signaling value of degrees, which may be a good thing from many people's perspective, but for us, we're not sure how to do filtering, because we don't, as with most exams in India, they're not selection exams, they're elimination exams. And all our hiring processes are also elimination exams, because you have this fire hose of 10 lakh people applying for 2,000 jobs. We don't know how to do that. So I'll just stop here saying that I loved your structural transformation agenda, because I've been a little disillusioned. Fiscal policy and monetary policy to me seem oversold, let's call it that, in the last 5-10 years. If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would be poor. And I've just spent 5 years on the RBI board. I'm not sure whether monetary policy is a placebo or a painkiller or a steroid. It's definitely not medicine or sustainable medicine. And I think the only way to sort of fix this is productivity. But the challenge then arises is the question which I always harass Rohini with this: is there a difference between a Ministry of Employment and a Ministry of Women's Employment, or a Ministry of Dalit Employment and a Ministry of Rural Employment? If there is a difference. I think that the supply-demand question, is supply the chef or is demand the waiter? Did Bangalore become a software hub because we had engineering deregulation college first, or did we have the IT companies first and then we had the engineering college deregulation in response to that? I don't know. I'm not sure we can answer that question. I mean, it's a chicken and egg problem, and the only way to solve a chicken egg problem is to become vegetarian, do something different. And so I think that, at least from my perspective, this agenda of formalization, urbanization, industrialization, human capital, and financialization, at least now seems to be articulated. I can give you specific examples on how it's getting integrated, on how it's, and so the question really is the gender gap really a growth gap? On some days I think it's not, but on some days I do think it is, and I look forward to today to hearing about whether it's that.
Fantastic. A lot of wonderful material for us to chew over in terms of how people land in jobs, prepare for jobs, and get to have their talents used. And I think the productivity point is central to all of today's discussion. Aparna, over to you.
Thank you. I'm the outlier. And I begin with that because I think I just want to see if we can just go back to the basics about why we're asking this question. And whether we're asking this question because, closing the gender gap in the labor force market, in the labor market will bring our GDP up, or because we believe that it's an intrinsic good, to see women have the same access to the labor market as, other genders do. And I think that's a fundamental question to sort of help us reposition what we mean by structure when we're talking about structural transformation. And I think we all struggle with that. We place a lot of emphasis increasingly as there is a drive towards formalization, the world gets increasingly financialized, and structures become more rigid, they become harder to change. And I thought I'd just talk about two stories to try and help us reflect on what a structure actually means. So, in my work, we've looked at a couple of things. We've looked at, for example, the experience that women have of violence in public spaces, not domestic violence, but how public space violence could be a deterrent towards participating not just in employment, but in public life. Activities of leisure, accessing public services, going to banks. How does public space violence affect it? Very difficult to quantify, but very much a part of women's lived experiences, right? So when you work with women in livelihoods programs, whether it's through your self-help groups, through helping them link with government schemes, market linkages, even just being able to have safe mobility to work, public space violence becomes significant. And we know that multiple kinds of interventions have been tried, looking at bystander interventions, we have coaches that are dedicated to women on Delhi subways, separate seating for women on buses, but really just trying to understand what's the impact of racial patriarchy, right? So I just placed that question there. I want to just throw out a few questions for us to really start thinking about how complex this idea of structure can be. The second is a story that's really stuck with me, because when we were doing this exploration around this question of this impact of, even if there's no real physical acts of violence that women may face, the fear and threat, the perception that you might not be safe, is something that keeps reinforcing a particular norm around women's active participation or active citizenship. Forget labor force participation. I think that comes as part of a larger set of questions to answer. So we discovered that, we all know that Bombay is considered the safest city for women in this country, Delhi much less so. But there was a survey that showed that when the mills were active in Bombay, in the 60s, they started to shut down in the 70s, the perception of women's safety really started to drop as the mills were shutting and there were fewer women commuting on trains. So their sheer presence, the presence of women in a public space, really dropped the perception and the threat of violence. So I think that's something that's really stuck with me, is what is this whole drive towards labor force? And Mahua, to your point, why is a woman's role in caregiving and raising children not as valued as her role in sort of being an economically productive participant? But that question aside, I think, why do we want this to change? Why is this an important question for us? And I think that story about the Bombay mills really sort of demonstrates that. The second is another story about a community that I worked with that actually has been traditionally a nomadic performance community that works with shadow puppets. They're a 400-year-old tribal community that had migrated from Maharashtra into the south of India over a course, around 400 years ago. And so there was a community of us that was actually looking at sort of how does labor work in artisanal communities, right? Because they now had to turn their performance art into a product in order to reach a different market and, sort of generate livelihood. So from their puppets, they started making lampshades, and they would sell lampshades, and lampshades became, and other trinkets, which then became the product that they could market. Now, what did that do to labor force within that community, between genders? When they were a nomadic community, men and women shared in their household work because they would have to pack up, they would travel, they would cook together, and women performed, in the shows that they would put up in villages equally. So both men and women participated equally in the labor of the production of the performance. They shared in the wages equally. When the state started to regularize they had to make a decision. So now, is this an art or is it a craft? What is this product that they're putting out? It was easiest because there was a material they were working with. The material was leather. So the Department of Leather Industries then took sort of ownership of the welfare of this community, and then they had to then apply for access to certain government schemes. And then the Ministry of Culture said, hey, here is this really cool performance. We can take you for some performances overseas. So you're going to now apply for, a passport. How does a nomadic community of performance apply for passports? They need an address. So then they sedentarize, they get an address. That made the shift happen in terms of how women participated in labor and productivity. Because suddenly having a fixed home meant that someone had to run the home and cook the meals, and the men began to travel outside. It shifted the power and agency that women had over their economic productive life, right? And I share both of these stories to just help us contextualize, because we continue to live and work in a country where informality and precarity define the economic space within which, particularly women and certainly men as well, negotiate, economic productivity and their ability to earn and save. I think it's important for us to sort of reflect back on the complexity and the diversity, because those green dots that were India they're stubborn, right? They just don't seem to want to shift. So what is it that's holding them there? And as much as the questions around culture are really hard to answer, we also hear that culture eats strategy for breakfast sometimes. So I think one can't ignore it, right? But also recognize that the changes have been rapid. Market forces have changed rapidly. But the reality of the communities at the grassroots haven't changed with, haven't kept pace, and one isn't always sure if keeping pace is the solution, right? Are there so then I throw the question back at us about if it is for an intrinsic good that we're interested in this question, then how do we define the structure that we seek to transform? I stop there.
Fantastic. What a rich, rich set of ideas. I think I have already like a few studies that I feel I want to pass, like especially when you were talking about mobility. There's an excellent study from Delhi that really tries to measure the trade-offs, just in terms of college choice, depending on college location and my mobility route there, and very precisely tell you what am I trading off to go to a college in a safer location and a safer bus route. And similarly, when you talked about the threat of fear, like the fear or threat of violence, which is not actualized, just the fear of it curtailing my actions. There's a really good paper out of Zambia that talks about in an environment where institutions, like when you think about institutions getting stronger over time, what does that mean? If I'm a small enterprise holder, I want to be able to defend my goods. Women often are less able to defend their goods when there's a fight. Like, I'm not going to want to be, beaten up by the others in the market. So institutions existing differentially help me, because then I can turn to them to protect my goods. So those kinds of institutional forces, informal, formal, may be doing something differentially for those who cannot get into a physical fight and win it. But these are the forces that are exactly. We have, I had a list of questions, but I'm going to open it up because this is such a rich set of ideas. So maybe Ashwini, then Rinanaben. Do we have a mic here? Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone for a fascinating panel. I just have a couple of points for Mahua. So one is, on the relationship between women's participation in NRLM SHGs and their labor force participation. I have a recent paper just out literally 3 weeks back, which is the first national level study of the relationship between the two. And we find that districts in which women's participation in NRLM is higher are also districts with higher labor force participation. So that's just, I'm happy to share the paper with you. On the question of measurement, I'm with you to a certain extent that yes, women's work in productive enterprises is not counted. But going beyond that, I think we need to be a little more careful. You look at two countries, Nepal and Bangladesh, both have registered an increase in female labor force participation rates. In Bangladesh, it's because women's participation in economic enterprises increased. In Nepal, they changed the definition. So work that was, like gathering water for, etc., that started to get included. It shot up to 80%. If we include care work, it will shoot up to 100% and it'll stay there. Then problem is solved. So I think that while we want to recognize women's participation in economic or productive work, we also, one, have to be careful about comparability with other countries. So labor force participation rate is a technical term that has a certain meaning. And if India was to just say, well, we don't recognize this meaning and we'll just say whatever it is, that's opting out of international systems. And if you want to be a global leader, that may not be that advisable. Secondly, on care work, why should it be only a woman's responsibility? Yes, children should have values. Children should grow up to be better citizens. But mothers and fathers both have to contribute to that. Not only mothers. So, I really want us to think about that.
Yeah, can I answer that first?
Sure, maybe a brief response and then to Rinanaben. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. When I'm talking about the labor force participation measurements, we need to take in the learnings from all these areas and we need to redefine it. I just wanted to say that we need to add up many aspects which are now missed out, but we need to be pragmatic enough to define it. Then the second part of it is that when we are talking of structural transformation, here I would like to give example of Jivika. When we started in 2006, the whole, it was not like that the SHG movement was not happening. It was happening, but we immediately did not start with livelihood promotion. We were criticized that you are a livelihood promoting organization and you are doing social development instead of livelihood promotion. How long will you take? So organizing women, it was very, very difficult to get the women out of their houses and sit and organize institutions for them. There were male dominance to a great extent. So, to breaking those working as an agency, breaking those structures were not an easy task. So, in 2006, when we were presenting in a world forum, we were saying that we have 500 odd SDGs, and people were coming up with 1 lakh SDGs, and we said that we are more process oriented, and there were political pressures that why aren't you moving ahead, and we said that no, SDG promotion is a process oriented work, and community institution formation is something that needs to be more recognized. See, organizing, institutionalizing the poor or institutionalizing the women is something which has strength. There needs to be a one-stop solution for a woman. When we talk of SDGs, we started with only 3 thematic areas: financial inclusion, and livelihoods, and finance. That's it. But now we have 22 thematic areas, thematic verticals that we are working on. Now we cannot, when we are only seeing as one indicator labor force participation. But when we talk about gender gap and when we are talking of growth, access to nutrition to women is an issue. So we need to start from there. The other aspect is that in Bihar we are all aware of cycle yojana, Balika cycle yojana. So when it was such a big transformation that happened, that if you would find young girls going out with a cycle, they would be criticized that haath se nikal ja rahi hai ladki aapki. She's going out of the control of women, or control of yours. So, but now when people go in cycle, that access to education has started happening. Enrollment of girls in education has started happening. Access to a safe toilet. Only Bihar has one policy which provides 2 special leaves for all women employers in the government for their menstrual hygiene. Can you imagine? No other state, no other government is providing that 2-day special leave every month to women. So you need to make policies conducive enough. There is 35% reservation is another issue. We should work on that. Reservation of 35% of women in all government employment. So these 35% women, and more generally 50% reservation in the local self-governance. All these reservations, and it takes time, but we all know that there is Mukhiya Patis, there are Sarpanch Patis which are coming in. But over a period of time, these transformations are happening. When at least you make people come on board, and then you do the capacity building, the changing of the mindset in a different manner. So in a very highly patriarchal society like Bihar, and a really backward state, if you can bring this silent revolution, this silent change of social structure through the SHG movement or through institutionalizing women, you can make a big dent, I suppose. And today, the government, the National Rural Livelihood Mission works with all 28 departments of government. So that sort of convergence, because everybody is today working in silos. So every output or every achievements are in silos. But if it is concerted and given down to that particular women household, that makes a change. Because after all, health department is also going to that particular household, education department is also going to that household. So toilets in the schools is a very important concept. Transportation, infrastructure for that, and of course the safety aspect, which was all talked about. But safety can only happen if there is that societal acceptance. That societal acceptance of girls traveling in a cycle to the school has happened in Bihar. So you have to bring in those sort of societal policy. Through enabling policies, you have to bring in that societal structural transformation. So,
thanks, Mahua. May I interrupt you? Sorry, yeah. I just want to make sure we can do one more. But that's absolutely fantastic. And on your point on how we institutionalize and enable, let me pass to Renana Ben, who had a point to make.
It is on. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. First, let me just say, I really found this a fascinating discussion, all three of the speakers. I don't have a question and therefore don't need an answer. But I have 2 points I want to make. One is, I thought what was very interesting was this whole discussion on culture, which is basically gender norms culture. And you sort of got 2 points of view between Aparna and Manish. I always fall on Manish's side, but
Thank you.
But when you're actually working, you realize how strong the norms are. The point, of course, being that you change them. But I thought that the three persons, what Mahua said later about actually changing cultural norms. So I hope much more is going to go into that during the day. But it's really fascinating, that whole discussion. The thing I really wanted to say was to Mahua, and I was very pleased to hear that the government the Livelihoods mission may be collecting data on women's participation rates. And the reason I tell you this is because 10 years ago, I'm from SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. We did a study with the government on women in the informal economy, urban and rural in Bihar. And at that time, I think it's supposed to have fallen, the women's participation rate in Bihar was 10%. We asked somebody else, a researcher from the ILO, to do a similar study for us, of course not through the whole state, but taking some villages. And with the same questions, they found it was more like a 54% participation rate. And when we did this, we presented it to the chief minister, actually presented 2 chief ministers, because the chief ministers changed in between. And when we told them that it's only 10% in Bihar, they laughed. That, 10% in Bihar, you see women in the fields all the time. But nobody was willing to challenge the NSS. And I find this very strange. On this particular point, nobody thinks it's important enough to challenge the NSS. So if you have data, please challenge the NSS data, because when the government challenges it, it'll make a difference. As Ashwini knows, we've been challenging it for decades, and it made no difference whatsoever. So I just wanted to say what you're doing there is very important. So please do it, and please put it before the NSS or whoever you think is the right person.
We are trying to do that. We are trying to take that up at
That's
that level.
Wonderful. I wish we had a lot more time, and I think we now have a very nice tea coffee break where you can. Oh, we have 10 more minutes? Oh, that's great. So then let's do another. I see a question at the back there.
Thank you. My name is Sandhya. I work at the Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi. So I just have one point to mention regarding the unpaid work. So my point is that if we, let's say, count unpaid work, do you think that will make, let's say, correlation between GDP growth and employment little weaker? I mean, if we say that every woman would be employed in that case. This is point which Professor Ashwini also mentioned. So can we, let's say, think of satellite account to national accounting in India? So where it is measured separately but does not interfere with the main paid activities that we all desire for women. Thank you.
Was that directed to any panelist or just a reflection?
Just a reflection comment.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
No, I think this is a really complex domain, thinking about what counts as GDP, and I think there are different approaches being discussed, and I think the ILO is also doing sort of some revision because it's the holder of the labor force stats. But excellent point. Yeah, go ahead, Aparna.
Could I respond to
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to sort of, point out that, I think this is not a culture versus the other structural pieces conversation. It's not I think this is where we often get stuck in these conversations. It becomes an either or, but I think it's both, right? The challenge, however, is the piece on the shift on the gender norms and culture is much more difficult to quantify. And therefore, either it's something that you set aside because you can't quantify it, or you say that it's too hard to change, and so we're going to work on the pieces that we can change. And then you find that you're working on the pieces that you can change, and then the one that you're not able to change holds you back, right? And so I think the challenge for us is to really figure out how do you apply that measurement lens at the intersection of the work that we need to do on the norm change, or how do you, because this morning Aishwarya said this was to be a generative discussion. How do you find those links? How do you develop the sets of indicators that can push us in the direction of saying, where's the intersection between the things that are not as obvious and the ones that feel like, I can find my answer here? Because the data is showing us, it's the measurement that's showing us that the change is not happening at the rate that it should be. And then there are, again, if you put it into the global context, you see MENA and you see South Asia, and you're seeing a similar pattern, right? You're seeing that pattern, but if you see it again intra-South Asia, there is variability. Mm-hmm. So clearly measurement is possible, but I wonder if we can apply ourselves to figure out how we measure that, and I think that's where a lot of us back off.
Yes, no, and I think this is a great point for this discussion, because this is a core part of this project as well, to figure out how to measure some of these more difficult to measure things like attitudes, beliefs, decision making, all of these which are part of these very embedded structures. So I'll take 3 more. We have 4 wonderful questions. So maybe very briefly, if you can raise your questions, and then I will let the panel go, with the panelists to pick what they'd like to respond to. So Simone, Hema, the person at the back, and Kavita. One last round. Very quick. Blusa. I see you. I don't know your name. Yes. But let's start with Simone, and then Hema, and then you, and then Kavita.
Okay, great. And I think this is not so much a question as just maybe a call for reflection across all of us, maybe building on some of the comments and questions that were just asked. Because, on some level, I completely agree with Mahua in that, women engage in a lot of productive activities that are not recognized by standard measures of, kind of labor force participation or national accounts. And, recognizing that is important. But, I think at the same time, the reality, and this isn't just about India, kind of participation in activities that are priced by the market confers power, right? I mean, we have members of the private sector on this board. It's like, it confers power in society, it confers power within households, and, on some level, I agree, kind of producing, investing in the next generation of citizens is like fundamentally important for the growth of society. But, the reality is that if you ask most men, they'd sort of say, well, that's lower status work. But why? Well, it's not priced by the market. And to the earlier question, this is a bit bizarre in that, I could hire a nanny to take care of my kids. That's an account in GDP, as will be the work I do outside the home. I stay home and take care of my kids. Like, none of that is priced, and none of that is, valued by the market. And so I personally struggle with thinking about, if those two things don't have equal value, we're going to have, kind of sorting, in this lines of groups trying to gain power. And, this matters in that it matters for productivity, right? Because then you have a mismatch between talent and skill. So if you have, kind of an entire class of workers that are confined to, one sector of the economy, they're not going to be, kind of doing other things they would be really great for. And that's, what starts to really matter for these growth gaps. And so I don't think I have like an answer for how to think about measuring and tracking these things, but it is a reason why I'm so excited about this initiative, and I think really kind of excited to try to maybe bring some of these perspectives, kind of together in service of both measurement and policy that serves us all better.
Fantastic. Excellent. Hema, maybe to you?
Hi, I'm Hema Swaminathan from IIM Bangalore, and this is a question for Manish. You talked about labor and supply and really the matching process, right? So I'm just curious, there's so much money being poured down skilling departments, skilling initiatives, coming in from the central government. Given the vast data that you have, you must be seeing obvious gaps in what people are coming in with and what the labor market is requiring, right? So have you sort of looked at it from a gender perspective, and how does this relate to this constraints that women are facing conversation with the aspirations that they might have, and are our policymakers reacting to this, right? I mean, so it's sort of a very, a question on what can be done. I mean, are you sort of using your data to reach out? Thanks.
Fantastic. Let me take the person at the back, and then Kavita very quickly, and then please respond.
Hi, the person at the back.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
It's okay. I'm Jaita from Tata Trust. So my point here is not a question, but a comment I wanted to make is that, while we are talking about inclusion of women, but I think it's equally important to also look at the issues around nurturing aspirations. And how are we looking at that when we are talking at both formal and informal sectors? So I'm specifically going to talk about the health sector, which has highest number of women workforce. 75% of the workforce in the health sector are actually women. But as we look at the career growth, the number starts actually dipping, which again, 4% of the women actually from that 75% making it through that journey as they progress in their career. And we also see that large number of women then falling off. So in terms of looking at inclusion, aspiration, and retention, I think the issue of retention has been talked about a lot when we talk about education and how enrollment vis-a-vis retention has been an issue for girls. But when we specifically look at the economic sector, I think it's very, very important to look at retention, but not just retention in terms of numbers, but how they are progressing in their journeys. Thank you.
Wonderful point. No, absolutely. And Kavita?
Yeah, my name is Kavita. I'm a journalist, and I want to take off from what Ashwini ji said about comparability. And I want to know whether anyone on the panel will comment on what do women want really. I understand that care work needs to be measured and understand that there are various perspectives around it. But is there any information about what women want to do, given that so many of them actually are in the formal workspace or perhaps informal economy, but in more productive, in what we call productive, economically productive work, but they fall out later? Maybe either maybe they got married, or they moved, or they had a child. So what is it that women actually want to do?
Great question. Can we measure that? I'll go around, maybe start with Manish, and then Aparna, and then Mahua. Yeah.
So I'll answer the first question, which I'm most qualified to answer, is what do women want? I think that's a... I would be careful with, and that this all three questions are connected. Simone's one, the person in the back. I work a lot with government, and Godhart's law, when the metric becomes the goal, the metric ceases to be useful. Be really careful about that. The goal here is prosperity. The goal here is freedom. The goal here is equality. And if we get into these pimple on the dimple on the left butt of the ant, I know it's useful to explain stuff, but then we will create metrics which we will meet. We will meet with vengeance. Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan has the goals and metrics have been met. But the goal was employability, if not education, and we didn't meet that. So I would just be careful with this including unpaid work or stuff like that. Is really complex, and it has real unintended consequences in government, because you will give the unit of performance, whether it's the district magistrate or the collector, or even if you go to BEO or BDO, you give them metrics. They will meet those metrics, but we won't meet our goals. So I would just be a little careful in this metric versus goal sort of this thing. And the question of what women want, obviously they will answer, but we've tried to convert that into metrics because we're not meeting the goal. and so when you convert that into metrics, we will meet the metrics, but we won't meet the goal. How does data improve matching was a direct question. I mean, we have done it, but you have to recognize, and I started by saying I have a narrow perspective. I don't represent India, I represent corporate India. I don't represent rural India, I represent urban India. I have employees in 5,000 cities, but most of my employees are in 52 cities. I have 50,000 clients, but most of my employees are in 4,000 clients. And most importantly, almost all my people work in sales, customer service, and logistics, which are the three fastest growing segments of India's job market. See, I'm the waiter, I'm not the chef. I don't decide where job. The three industries which created Team Lees are on strike, right? Financial services, telecom, and retail. But I don't care. I've moved on to FMCG, I've moved on to FMCD, I've moved on to wherever the economy goes. So I'm probably not the right person to say, are we using data to improve the broad-based skill systems? But we really are using data to improve matching. 2 cities in 3 sectors and 4,000 clients. That's a limited answer, but I think higher tech, adding reg tech to India's digital public infrastructure is going to really matter, and that obviously I care about because there's 6,700 filings, there are 67,000 compliances, and there are 26,400 ways to go to jail for an Indian employer. But adding reg tech, but adding higher tech to DPI, you'll bang into questions, and obviously people don't like the questions we ask, privacy versus this. But most of the job seekers who come to us, we had 2 lakh people come to us last month, we only hired 10,000 of them, they would be willing to trade off privacy for the job. So when you add higher tech to matching, you start banging into I start banging into the, 14 court cases from the Ayatollahs of privacy right now, who have taken me to court saying that your improved matching is not worth it.
Thank you, Manish. I know I agree with you. I think chasing the metric and losing sight of the goal is something that's been challenging all of us because the metric doesn't define the goal. But Simone, I want to pick up with where you left us, which is, I think if we recognize that what we're trying to shift are structures of power, then it really shifts everything that we're talking about, right? And then all the other things that we're talking about in terms of the gains that we see in productivity, et cetera, then just become a surrogate marker for how much power, agency, voice, decision-making, leadership do we see transfer, to shift that power. And so to Jaita's point about, and we see this all the time, we even see this in Scandinavian countries where participation like in STEM disciplines is pretty much equalized across genders, but then you don't see women at the leadership levels, right? So I think the question is, the question that our journalist friend was asking about, what is it that women want? Like Manish said, he doesn't represent all of India. I don't think it's easy to say that this is what women want because women are not a monolithic structure. But I think we can get to saying that clearly if we start shifting power for women to make their own decisions, that's something I think that most women would want. I think I could fairly safely say that. But a lot of women don't even have the decision-making power to arrive at that. And I think that's the ground that one tries to shift in this work. And it's hard work. And I think it's also important for us to recognize that these are conversations we've only been having for a few decades. And in the arc of history and gender inequality, it's not been a very long time. So things I think are shifting, but not quickly enough. And then the structures that we try to shift, we keep changing the definition of the structure. And so my plea would be that if we can get to some consensus about what is the structure that we're trying to shift. If you're the government, if you're the private sector, if you're corporate India, if you're working with the women's SHG, all of us come from a very diverse set of perspectives. But some common understanding of what the structure is that we're trying to shift, I think, can help us by centering, not the prototype of a woman, but just centering this idea of power and how we share that power. That's the best answer that I can come up with right now.
Fantastic. Again, this is all wonderful material. Mahua, one last minute, and then we go for tea coffee.
So I had three points to make, taking all from your questions. Retention and progression is very much important. So one example what Jivika has done is that Jivika is an organization which has at least reached to the gender balance of 49% women workforce. In Jivika, we have a workforce of 9,000 employees. How did we do it? So we changed our policy at the recruitment level. We said that field level or the frontline workers, basic qualification for women would be matriculation, and for men it would be graduation. That brought in more of frontline workers, women frontline workers. So we have such policies. If organizations like us can do this, many other organizations can do it. The second point is when we are talking of community aspirations or women aspirations, now it all, and also the power dynamics, when we are working in SHGs, we follow this leadership rotation policy. So even in an SHG, the 3-member office bearers has to take a lot of decisions. So a lot of membership trainings, a lot of community level trainings are imparted so that they can, participate in the decision making. And today a cluster level federation handles a budget of over 5 crores annually, and it's all managed by women. So, and the decisions that they are taking, whom to give the credit appraisal that they are doing at every level. We have around 1 lakh community resource persons who are either working as bank mitras, bank sakhis, community nutrition resource persons, also external resource persons, external community resource persons. They are going to, from Bihar's very remote villages, they are going to Arunachal Pradesh, they are going to Rajasthan, they are going to Jharkhand and other places to again teach them how to work in an SHG, and they come back with a resource fee of 1 lakh rupees and they invest in their land. They are having now property in their own name. Women having property in their own name. So that's their hard-earned money, and they are investing in getting property on their own name. We have found social transformation happening through our community resource persons who have just broke down because she was selected as a trainer, and she said that how can I train people in burqa? So I have to do away with it. So these sort of changes that are happening, and she is a role model today. At the age of 40, she is pursuing her graduation. So these sort of, community engagement is very much important. Communitization of processes, institutionalization of women to raise their voice and also learn from the role models that are in their own villages, in their own locale, is something that we need to work on. We are also working on the urban livelihood mission, and we try to bring in all the learnings that we are having from the rural livelihood mission into the urban livelihood mission as well. I know urban poor is a very challenging area that we need to work with the nomads, with people who are migrating all the time. But there needs to be a concerted effort, and what we learned is that these aspirations of women come out in their SHG meetings, come out in their in these community platforms that they are working on. They are dealing with the banks in that particular area. They are dealing with the agriculture department. They are going to the block administration. They are gaining that power, and the men now have started recognizing, because all the loans or credit are coming in the name of the women in their bank accounts. So that's the power, the decision making that is happening in that particular area, and that is the structural change or cultural change that is happening in many parts of the country. And we need to learn from this particular program how we can make it happen in other parts of the country as well.
Thank you so very much. An absolutely fascinating panel. Thank you. Join me in thanking the panel. Thank you so much.